Good evening. We are now going to begin Interfaith Scholar Weekend 2023, its 25th iteration. We have gone actually 2 years using only Zoom, but this year, for the first time in 3 years, we are here to celebrate that much of the pandemic is something we can live with at this point. We can meet in public, we can be careful, but we can also join in community and celebrate again. So in honor of the first time we're back up again, it is our honor to have a speaker coming all the way from New York, representing Interfaith Alliance in the capital of our country. But we have 4 respondents from the local community to what it is that we will be hearing from Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. On that note, we're going to begin the program by having Dr. Ken Hansen begin our evening by making a land acknowledgement, so we'll remember the rights and the dignity of the people on whose land we are living at this moment in our time. Dr. Hansen.
Good day, my relations. How's everybody doing?
Very good.
I would like to introduce myself in a native way. My name is Kenneth Hansen. I'm a pre-ICWA adoptee. On my mother's side, my biological mother's side, I'm supposed to have heritage among the Makoche Shawnee, the Cherokee, and the Lakota peoples. This land was held in stewardship by Yokits and Mono people from time immemorial. It was taken, it's unceded land, but it was taken by the U.S. government through 18 treaties, which ended up not being ratified because after the treaties were signed, the government decided they weren't going to ratify any more treaties. So the land was taken, but the people were not compensated for it. People who lived in this area were Yokits and Mono peoples, and of the Yokits people from around this area. There's some names you've probably heard of, but maybe some you haven't. They include Gashoa, Ketchee, Chichansee, Chowchilla, Choinumni, and people along those lines. Mono people also, you know, their name for themselves is the Nim. Mono was bestowed upon them by colonizers. But they also came through the valley periodically. People traveled around a lot. There were not hard and fast borders and that kind of thing. So in case you didn't know that little bit of history, in case you didn't know that little bit of history, now you know. And so at some point, you know, some of this land needs to find its way back to the original stewards. With that, Homotakio, thank you very much.
Having welcomed you to the land that we're standing on, now I'd like to bring up Deacon John Sapino, who will welcome you to the parish church where we are now celebrating this event tonight. Deacon John Sapino.
Welcome on behalf of the St. Paul Catholic Newman Center, our staff, and our faith community. We're excited that you're here. As a fellow New Yorker, I'd like to welcome Dr. I grew up in the Bronx. We've been involved with the Interfaith Scholar Weekend for many years, pretty close to 20 years, I believe. And we've also been a big part of the Interfaith Alliance. We also take part in the clergy caucus, the clergy coalition. So we have been, as a community, really involved. And my predecessor, or Father Perry Kavuchin, was also, I guess he was the person who got us involved directly as we began close to 20 years ago, as I said. So we have a lot of history, a lot of great history. Some of my most memorable moments have been involved in events, in particular in our Thanksgiving prayer evening. We've attended many times and also been hosting. So thank you again for being here. Excited that you're here, and I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation. Thank you.
And my last introduction will be to bring up Karen Hale, one of our local leaders in our own Interfaith Alliance of Central California. She's been a real champion for what is the principle of the Interfaith Alliance. Let Karen please introduce our keynote speaker for this whole weekend, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. Karen.
Good evening, and I wanted to say that meeting Paul has been a joy, and he told me he wanted at least 10 minutes, but no. Anyway, he has been our director leader of our national alliance, Interfaith Alliance, since September, and he has great goals for what we can achieve. But I'm going to start with what we believe, because this is going to be sort of the heart of why I care. We believe that religious freedom is a foundation of American democracy. We believe that matters of personal conscience must be held sacred, but no one has the right to impose their beliefs on others. We believe that religious and political extremists are a threat to individual liberty and democracy. We believe that religious and cultural diversity are essential in building vibrant communities. And we so want to build a vibrant community here. And our national policy is we promote legislation that protects the boundaries between religion and government so that politics doesn't infringe on your faith, and matters of faith don't infringe on your freedom.
Well, I feel this has already been so rich, so we're going to hopefully go from glory to glory. But I really appreciate the introduction, the land acknowledgement, and thank you so much for hosting us here. And I'm going to be an advertiser. There's a fish fry right next to him. And everybody's going to get hungry, and everybody should go, help out. I bet it's a youth group or something like that. Now, listen, as someone who's done my time in pastorship, I'm saying go support the kids. Anyway, I'll just say I am really delighted to be here this weekend and with this whole community to dive into the Interfaith Scholars Weekend. I am grateful to the respondents who I will be in conversation with today. I'm really looking forward to learning from you and being part of a broader conversation. I want to thank all the groups that were involved in making this happen. And so just really appreciate everyone who was involved and with the Interfaith Alliance of Central California, of course. But there's one person I just want to single out, and that's this guy right here. Who is the chair for the Big College Weekend. He has been incredibly gracious, tireless. Yeah, there we go. That's the way they know. Does that happen to you often, where someone does that to you? I mean, that's like a very lovely.
I'm there every time I'm anywhere.
Yeah, anyway, that's the kind of greeting. Anyway, I'm very grateful to you. You've been so lovely to work with, so thank you. And I'm so just broad thanks overall. I come this evening to share words of solidarity, of support, of hope for this community, and I'm eager to listen and learn about what's happening here in this community and hopefully join you in casting a vision for a truly diverse, welcoming, and hopeful Central California where everyone from every background is understood to have inherent dignity, and is afforded equal treatment under the law. Walter Cronkite, who was the honorary chair of the Interfaith Alliance Board of Directors for over a decade, was fond of saying that our work was nothing less than the preservation of democracy. And those words resonate in 2023 as much as they ever have. So everyone in this room has an entry point for reflecting on where we come from, where we are today, and where we're going as a country. And I want to start my remarks with a bit of personal history to share with you how I entered this conversation about religion in America. My great-great-grandparents on my father's side came to the United States after the uprisings of 1848 across Europe that were also known as the People's Spring. Some of my great-grandparents lived in Vienna, some in Prague. All experienced the restrictions, taxations, and degradations that came from being Jewish in the Christian-dominated European continent. One of my Jewish ancestors was named Joseph Goldmark, who was a central figure in the revolution that took place in Vienna against the monarchy. And when the uprising was successful, Joseph was part of the first Reichstag in the history of Austria that was formed with an intent to represent the people. The government only lasted for 18 months before it was dissolved when the monarchy was restored to power. And Joseph was forced to flee as a refugee to America. But during that brief time, they passed several groundbreaking laws that included freedom for the serfs, freedom of the press and arts, as well as lifting the restrictions on the Jews. Unfortunately, when the People's Spring was crushed, the laws protecting the Jews were quickly nullified, and retribution in Vienna and Prague and across Europe against those who had participated in the uprising was severe, and in many cases, specifically targeted the Jews that took part. So Goldmark, along with my other ancestors, the Dembitz family, the Whaley family, and the Brandeis family, picked up their lives and moved to America. Arriving on these shores, my ancestors experienced freedom previously unimagined for them. A place where they could have dignity for who they were, no matter what religious background they came from. The freedom of religion was truly amazing to them, and they wrote back to their family members in Europe expressing their love for their new country. Now, I'll pause here. Some of you are assuredly asking how these Jews had a descendant who was a reverend. But I'll save that story for another day. But the important thing is here is the freedom my ancestors experienced was not an accident. The founders of America were thoughtful and intentional about the role that religion would play in the country, and they ascribed that intention in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It simply could not be clearer. For anyone suggesting today that America was founded as a Christian nation, they are arguing against the Constitution. My Jewish ancestors arrived less than 6 decades after then President George Washington wrote his famous letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, assuring them equal status in the United States, telling Jewish congregants, all possess alike, this is a quote, all possess alike liberty of conscience, immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States give no bigotry, no sanction to persecution, no assistance to bigotry, no sanction to persecution, no assistance. And if we needed more proof that the founders did not intend the United States to be a Christian nation, the Treaty of Tripoli makes it explicit. How many in this room know what the Treaty of Tripoli is? I see one. Okay. Believe me, this is not a got you. It's just, this is unfortunately not a part of our history that we recognize. It was written by George Washington in 1796 to avoid war with Muslim nations over trade. The treaty was signed by John Adams and ratified unanimously by a Senate that was still half filled with signers of the Constitution. The treaty says, and I quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion," I'm going to say that one more time. This is the founders of our country. "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religious, or tranquility of Muslimen, what can you do? And as the states never had entered into any war or act of hostility against Mohammedan nations, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries." That's a treaty of the United States showing the intention. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, reinforced the First Amendment and coined the phrase, the separation of church and state, and showed his comfort with a diverse religious American nation by quipping, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to believe in 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." I mention all of these examples because the next time someone tells you that America was founded as a Christian nation, they are factually incorrect and intentionally misleading and rewriting history, attempting to superimpose a religious hierarchy onto a country that was founded intentionally to do just the opposite. As Princeton historian Kevin Cruz has written, despite the founders' intent, later generations of Americans began to assert that the country they created was indeed Christian. Now, claims of being a Christian nation have also come with an implicit white supremacy that really translates into a white Protestant nation. My family experienced freedom in their new country in part because in the mid-1900s, Jews of Northern Europe were granted status as white. However, the reality that they confronted was that a large portion of the population that was not white was also not free. Their religion was devalued and not considered American. The brutal institution of slavery that had been part of the same country that has espoused the values of freedom since the beginning. Just a few years after my ancestors arrived, the Supreme Court decided in the odious Dred Scott case that upheld slavery and further ruled that because Mr. Scott was of African descent, he could not be a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. The toxic mix of racism and religious bigotry was apparent in the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan marched down 50,000 strong the streets of Washington, D.C. against the full rights of Black Americans, Jews, and Catholics, explicitly threatening violence against them. In the 1920s, laws were passed to restrict immigration through a quota system that promoted immigration from Western and Northern countries to keep out the perceived dangerous influence of the Catholic and Jews from Eastern and Southern Europe. These laws were also used to restrict Muslim and Hindu populations from the Middle East and South Asia that have been growing in the country. Again, the aim was to restrict both non-white races as well as non-Christian religions. Also in the 1920s, the so-called prerequisite cases decided by the Supreme Court denied citizenship rights to a Japanese petitioner and a South Asian petitioner on the grounds that they were not white. A few decades later, in response to the perceived threat of atheist communism, the phrases "one nation under God" and "in God we trust" were introduced into the common language of America. In 1949, and again in 1954, the National Association of Evangelicals proposed a constitutional amendment putting God and Jesus in the nation's constitution. And they were defeated by a coalition of Christian and Jewish groups specifically. The effort to put God and Jesus in the Constitution only further underscores the fact that those words are not there to begin with, intentionally left out in order to avoid exactly what more recent Christians have tried to impose. And here's another point that's obvious but needs to be made. Religion is too often used for terrible means. A powerful strand of religion was instrumental in undergirding the white supremacy and sanctioning slavery. Religion professor Harry Stout of Yale University wrote, "White Christians in the South didn't just support slavery. The Southern Church was the backbone of the Confederacy. And in its attempts to keep African Americans in bondage, Southern clergy had no doubt that slavery was not a sin." This support of white supremacy and oppression of Black Americans continued after emancipation through Jim Crow and the battle over civil rights, and it continues on today. Religious claims from the 1600s were also inherent in the doctrine of discovery, used to legitimize the abrogation of rights and the takings of land from indigenous people for the last 4 centuries. The examples of religious support for slavery and continued support for white supremacy and the taking of indigenous lands across the continent and attacks on indigenous communities and their belief, often in the name of Christianity, is a necessary reminder that while freedom of religion is important, it is necessary. Religion itself is not de facto good. And so when we talk about freedom of religion, we have to pointedly ask, whose religion and whose freedom? The language of the First Amendment makes clear that freedom to believe as we choose is unalienable, but it is not unlimited. This freedom of conscience to believe what we want exists in a constellation of civil rights and civil liberties that ensure that every one of us can engage our democracy with equal dignity. How we engage one another is perhaps summed up in the legal truism, "Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins." Which brings us to Christian nationalism. How's that for a segue? Christian nationalism. It's the most serious threat to the principle of religious freedom that we were founded upon, and it represents an existential threat to our democracy. Christian nationalists revel in denying the history and proclaiming our country a Christian nation that they conveniently remake in their own image. They are determined to impose the imprimatur of their narrow faith tradition upon the laws of the land, using the power of courts and government. And perhaps most dangerous of all, they use the rhetoric of a Christian nation with its underpinning of white supremacy, xenophobia, patriarchy, authoritarianism, to dictate who is a true American and who will be relegated to a perennial outside status to be tolerated in just such a manner that George Washington declared should never happen. The goal of Christian nationalism is the establishment of a theocracy. As Catherine Stewart explained on my podcast, State of Belief, shameless plug, State of Belief podcast, Christian nationalism is an ideology. It is a political movement and a quest for power. Unfortunately, Christian nationalism is not relegated to the shadowless corners of our country. A poll recently released by Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings indicates that close to 30% of Americans are either adherents or sympathetic to Christian nationalism, and that among white Protestant evangelicals, that number jumps to nearly 2/3. Over 1 in 4 Americans believe the United States should declare itself a Christian nation. Not surprisingly, negative attitudes towards the rights of Black Americans, immigrants, Jews, Muslims, LGBTQ people, the role of women, are remarkably higher in the adherents and sympathizers to Christian nationalism than in the wider population. I can't go through all this. This is available online, so it's actually a really important research drop that happened 3 weeks ago. But just the attitudes on race. In the poll conducted by PRI, close to 80% of Christian nationalists disagree with the statement that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for many Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. The poll also shows that among avowed Christian nationalists who are white, 85% believe that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against blacks. No wonder Christian nationalists are behind the effort to ban African American studies programs. No wonder they don't want people to say gay. No wonder they are banning books. No wonder there is an increased anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate overall. No wonder they are treating immigrants like props and sending them up to New York and DC to score points. It's deeply grounded in a Christian nationalist worldview of how they want our country to look and act, and they're determined to get their way. A few other scary things, and then I'm going to get to the hopeful part. As Catherine Stewart recently wrote in the New Republic, Christian nationalists are increasingly framing their efforts as a spiritual battle that resonates with many of its followers from the more charismatic and Pentecostal traditions. Christian nationalism pits the power of Jesus, their side, versus the power of Satan. This is not only being preached in churches, mind you, more elected political figures are taking on this language. Governor Stitt of Oklahoma prayed after his re-election, "Father, we just claim Oklahoma for you. Every square inch, we claim it for you in the name of Jesus. Father, we can do nothing apart from you. We don't battle flesh and blood against principalities of darkness." What should a person think from another religious tradition or a different political view or no tradition? What is their standing when the highest official in the state is praying in such a way as to explicitly put them in a second-class status and also as spiritually opposed to the well-being of the state? Florida Governor DeSantis quoted Ephesians from the Bible when he claimed the mantle of God against all who would oppose him, saying during his campaign, "Put on the full armor of God, stand firm against the left's schemes." Now, you may or may not recognize that when you say the left, the Bible says devil, but you replace them with the left. There are so many others, but these two governors are two of the highest placed officials in the country, and they are openly calling their opponents agents of evil, which puts politics into this zero-sum realm of spiritual warfare. Okay, one last piece of bad news, and then I promise. Part of the PRI poll asked this question: because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. And Christian nationalists responded affirmatively at 7 times the rate of the rest of the population. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans assert that not only is the United States a white Christian nation, but also that they are willing to fight to preserve it. We've seen this. We saw this when the white Christian nationalists marched through Charlottesville with torches saying Jews will not replace us, or when President Trump used tear gas and violence on the protesters in Lafayette Square in order to hold up a Bible as a prop at St. John's Church, and of course, most notably on January 6, 2021, in the deadly attack in our nation's capital by insurrectionists holding crosses and waving Jesus banners as they attempted to thwart the will of the people in the election and subvert our democracy. So I hope we can recognize the wide disparity between the intentions of the founders of our country to create a nation that would be welcoming to people of every religious tradition and no religious tradition, and the claims and aims of Christian nationalism in the 21st century. Now here's the good news. As of now, Christian nationalism is very unpopular. 70% of Americans reject the calls to declare America a Christian nation. Close to 75% of Americans said they preferred a country made up of diversity of faiths, not just Christianity. 80% of Americans reject the idea that Christians should exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Christian nationalist views on race, gender, immigration, and LGBTQ people are also unpopular and as of now out of step with the American people. Demographic trends are also against Christian nationalism. The people who represent the core of Christian nationalism look a lot like me. Older, white, Protestant evangelical. I'm not Protestant evangelical, but I am Protestant. And all those categories are in decline in this country. Before the 2016 election, the head of PRI research, Robbie Jones, released the book, The End of White Christian America, which showed the decline of the Christian and white population and how America was becoming much more diverse in every way, including religiously, including the rise among the young of people who adhere to no faith tradition. So here's what's animating the Christian nationalist movement, and it's the most powerful and worst motivator. It's fear. Trump tapped into this fear with his backwards-facing MAGA motto in 2016, and just last week in CPAC, Trump warned his followers, "This is the final battle. If we don't do this, our country will be lost forever." They've made their goal clear. They're attempting to hold on to power, and as the polling shows, they're willing to do just about anything to achieve it. And it's up to us to make sure that they're not going to be successful. And we're going to win. We are. I recently had the chance to interview Rabbi Sandra Lawson, who's a Black, queer, Jewish woman rabbi. And I asked her, what gives you hope in the face of your life lived at the intersection of so many identities under attack right now? She said, Paul, we've already won. I see the progress. I see we are no longer the same country my grandparents lived in. At the same time, bad actors keep trying to bring all that back. But I see progress is made, and we have so much further to go, but we're going to win. And I was shocked by her resilience and her positive worldview, but I appreciated the political strategy that it contained. We're going to stand up to Christian nationalism by naming it, by saying it's not what we want our country to be, and we're also going to win by casting a much more beautiful vision for this country, for our communities, for our city, for our nation, that invites everyone to participate with equal dignity for the people of faith and no faith to live their life freely. Together, we will celebrate an inclusive understanding of religious freedom and demand that our religious and moral and ethical commitments around racial equity, marriage equality, freedom of women, and public schools deserve equal treatment to those who claim the mantle of religion, but mean it to benefit the very few. We will support the right to say, yes, anyone can believe anything they want, but that doesn't mean they can do anything they want. The right to swing their fist or their faith ends where our noses and our precious lives begin. InterFaith Alliance was formed almost 30 years ago specifically to counteract the outsized influence of the so-called moral majority who claimed that they represented the religious perspective and attempted to tell everyone that represented the religious view of the country. Since then, we have worked with people of over 75 different faith traditions, as well as secular and humanist groups, to offer an alternative vision of how an inclusive religious freedom can benefit a diverse democracy. A recent example was in the fight for marriage equality in Washington, where InterFaith Alliance helped to build a large coalition of religious groups that proclaimed marriage equality was part of our faith commitments and that we all deserve the right to love whom we choose. We specifically mobilized around the religious freedom amendments that were proposed by the bill's bipartisan sponsors, Senator Baldwin and Collins, and gathered support from many of the major religious traditions, including the Sikh community that came out strongly for marriage equality for the first time. Dick Durbin responded to claims from the far right that said that the marriage equality was anti-religious freedom by recognizing our letter as proof of the wide coalition that actually was very wide, that more closely represented the will of the American people, which poll after poll of religious Americans have supported marriage equality. This is just one example of a proactive mobilization that can and must happen in the country to defeat Christian nationalism. Part of the reason the Respect for Marriage Act was so important as a piece of legislation, it was clear that the Supreme Court could not be relied upon to protect a diverse democracy. We have to show up at school boards, at the voting booth, in our civic and religious spaces, and insist that America is for all of us, not just for some. We have to widen the circle of people who count in America, not restrict it. We cannot let anyone flatten the moral arc of this universe. Now, I am a religious person. I am a pastor. And I reject Christian nationalism because it corrupts my Christian faith and preaches a false gospel of bigotry and domination. I'm an American who loves my country and is grateful to this country for the safe haven it offered my family 175 years ago. And I love my country enough to want us to recognize our past, repair all that has been harmed, and commit to a future of America being a place of freedom for all people. I want to show up to defeat Christian nationalism by showing a wide inclusion and actually being a force of love, even for those Christian nationalists who may fear me or even hate me. In our movement, I want us to fight for everyone, including very conservative Christians, to be able to believe whatever they want and take their place in the mosaic of this nation. It is part of the definition of a democracy that we will live our lives alongside people with whom we will disagree. My deepest prayer is that we can invite people who think that Christian nationalism is the way they have to live out their Christian faith to join us in a wider circle of people of faith and no faith who truly want to live side by side with one another in mutual respect and understanding. Paul, I want to show up with my Jewish, Sikh, Indigenous, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, atheist, Christian neighbors, with all of you, to protect your right to believe as you choose. I want to be a part of a movement where religion shall be a bridge, not a bludgeon. I want to be a part of a movement where religion shall liberate, not subjugate. I want to be a part of a movement in a country where religion will be part of a diverse democracy, not a power grab for an exclusive theocracy. Tomorrow we'll be having a training on interfaith advocacy that leads on the best of the American traditions of diverse groups coming together to work side by side to make America better for all. I hope many of you will be joining us. At a recent training we offered in Dallas, Texas, a pastor stood up at the end of the day and told the group, "I feel less alone." And that is what I pray for here today, that we feel less alone, less isolated, and more equipped and inspired to show up for one another. The greatest example of interfaith advocacy in America continues to be the civil rights movement and the indelible image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, walking side by side with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. It brings me back to my great-grandfather in Vienna, who wanted freedom for himself and the wider Jewish community and was prepared to fight for it on the floor of the Reichstag. But when the time came for the discussion, it was his friend, a Catholic priest named Father Fuster, who stood up in 1849 and told the assembly why the Jewish struggle was his struggle. And he said, and I quote, "If we free the Jews, we free ourselves from the sway of Christian barbarism and of tyrannical Christian bigotry." So it was Christians who stood up for the Jews in Austria. That priest's liberation as a Christian was tied up in the work to free his Jewish compatriot from oppression. We can and we will show up for one another and for our democracy that needs every one of us. One of the sons of the Jewish families that came to America from Europe was my great-grandfather Louis Brandeis, who became the first Jewish justice of the Supreme Court. And while he had much to say about the power of the court and the politicians, his most sincere belief was encapsulated in this quote: "The most important political office is that of the private citizen." This is our time and our calling. Fellow humans, let's rise up and work together to ensure a welcoming, diverse, and just America that celebrates the many so that we might truly be one. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you
Very much looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say and learning more.
Thank you, Pastor Rauschenbusch, for this tremendous keynote starting off the weekend. When our committee worked up its plan for what would be the 3 days, we did propose certain things, and Paul responded very positively that he would have certain presentations, but there'd be moments when there would be a real effort of dipping into the community that we already have here with very strong leadership from all these diverse groups that Paul was mentioning. Different ethnicities, different traditions, different religions, and different non-religions. So what we decided tonight is to bring up 4 different scholars who will offer from what they know the topic was going to be, and then listening to Paul tonight, speaking from their own base, what that message means to them and to their community, to the people they most are feeling are on the downside of what it is that Paul was speaking about. The marginalized, the alienated, the non-included, the excommunicated, the ones who are not able to be themselves totally. So the first person that was going to speak tonight is unable to get here because of where she lives out in the foothills. So Dr. Vina Howard, who is a tremendous philosopher, a tremendous Gandhi scholar, a nonviolent genius who has worked with James Lawson deeply over many, many social issues, civil rights. She did ask that I would make a plug for a film that she is very involved with in her department, which is the M.K. Gandhi Center here at Fresno State. There'll be a film on the 16th at 6 p.m. in Peters Auditorium. I'm going to send to everybody who came tonight the link to more information about this film, which is all about the wife of Mahatma Gandhi. She has decided, this filmmaker, to put together a praise and an antiphon in honor of someone who people don't know about. We know about Mahatma Gandhi. We don't know about his wonderful wife, who was his guru, says the Mahatma. So we'll send you the information about this wonderful film, the 16th, right on campus, Peters Auditorium, 6 p.m. On that note, we're going to bring up the second respondent to Paul's presentation, and that would be someone you met a little before, Dr. Ken Hansen, who will speak to us about a group that Paul mentioned briefly, the indigenous community of the world. Those who have been totally colonized, who have suffered such ravaging in the name of religion, not only the doctrine of discovery, but church practice and policy, all about the tragedy of what it is to be a minority in a dominant culture. Dr. Hansen, could you speak to us about what this means to you and your community? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all again. Thank you, Pastor Paul, for your remarks. It's extremely educational. I enjoyed the talk very much. Let me first say, I'm not a religious leader at all, so I make no claim to that. I do take part in ceremony with my adopted tribe, the Cholone people, and they are a California Indian tribe whose historic territory where they provided stewardship was over what is now presently Pinnacles National Park. They were relocated from there into the mission systems, Mission Soledad specifically. After the fall of the mission systems, they were cut loose. At one time, people had some land around Cayucas and where Hearst Castle is, and of course, during the gold rush days, they were swindled out of it. Survived the genocide of California Indians, where 300,000 people were reduced to 30,000 people by the state of California, and were relocated to the Bakersfield area and were among the founding population of Bakersfield. And they've been good friends for a good many years. And I work for them as tribal staff in addition to my position at the university. I'm a political scientist, so I tend to view everything through the lens of naming, framing, and blaming. Which is kind of what politics is. And by definition, us here having this conversation is a political act, and it's an act of resistance. So this is an important conversation, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. If you're interested in kind of a native view of Christianity, there's a great book by a guy named Mark Charles. And he's Navajo and he's a Christian minister, and he ran an independent presidential campaign in 2020, a write-in campaign, because it's hard for ordinary folks to get on the ballot with all that, without all that corporate sponsorship and super PACs and all of that stuff. His book is entitled Unsettling Truths. And it has kind of a double entendre because it's about how do we unsettle our society from the settler mentality that we're socialized into from the time that we're very, very small. And he deconstructs Christianity to its, going back, how is it that Christianity becomes associated with empire, right? And he goes back to Aquinas and deals with that. Much of the book is about the doctrine of discovery. He deals with that. He deals with his own people's experience, the longest walk, which is, the Navajo equivalent of the Trail of Tears, and, how Father Abraham Lincoln is not really our Father Abraham, is often depicted, and he's very much an agent of genocide, as were a lot of other people. So anyways, it's an excellent book about all of those things. Another point I'd like to make is, your heroes are not always our heroes. Sometimes the liberals are just as bad. Perhaps not meaning to be, but again, so much of the racism is baked into the system to the point where, if you want to kneel at a football game, as an act of protest because you're protesting racism, it's seen as you protesting the entire country. That's how baked in it is sometimes. There's a fellow by the name of Vine Deloria, who's the Lakota scholar, and he's basically, the father of American Indian studies as an academic field. He's written most of the canon when it comes to law, history, politics, and all of that. And he writes about how, essentially we have two religions in the United States. We have the professed Christianity on the part of the Christian nationalists who have written so much of our history, despite what the rest of us think, but also the secular religion. And a lot of the institutions protect that secular religion of the state, which is designed to further the interest of oligarchy, essentially. And so, if we're not running afoul of one, we're probably running afoul of the other, which is why so much of government policy has had such a negative effect on indigenous people in the United States. And then other countries have copied it, of course. There's an important case called the Ling decision from 1990. For 100 years, native religions and I say that plural because there's not one native religion, there's a variety. And, but they were all outlawed during the Indian Wars when something called the ghost dance became popular among Western tribes. And the ghost dance scared the living hell out of all of these settlers, especially those, who were, the government hired a lot of Quaker and Methodist ministers to try to run reservations and try to run the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because the politicians that had been running those institutions were notoriously corrupt. So their solution was to try to replace them with people of good moral character. It's an admirable goal, but none of these people were necessarily culturally competent, or competent really at running a lot of things like government agencies. And so this, is presenting itself with, or manifesting itself in another set of difficulties. But the policy that results from this is highly destructive, and it goes along with the family separation policy, where children were taken and put in boarding schools to be Christianized and to be socialized into being good Americans. The theme was kill the Indian to save the man. And these boarding schools lasted for a century, as did the prohibition on practicing native religion. So now, what have we learned about when we try to make something illegal? Does it go away? Of course not. It just goes underground, where a black market emerges, to take care of whatever demand people have. So native religions went underground. And it's not till 1978, when Congress passes the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, that we're allowed to have ceremony again out in the open. Well, the Supreme Court, in the majority opinion, is written by Sandra Day O'Connor, who's at least a centrist, if not a liberal, on a lot of things, basically negated the Indian Religious Freedom Act. The reason being that it ran afoul of the secular interests of the state. And that's not really the terminology that she used in the opinion, but that is the way the Finding Laureate looks at it. And the issue here, a big difference between indigenous religions and the world religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so on, is that native religions are very much place-based. We have sacred places where revelation happened, from time immemorial. And the United States of America, generally speaking, does not recognize those as being holy places. And so if it runs afoul of someone perhaps making a few bucks, then, well, we'll send the bulldozers in and they'll take care of it. And unfortunately, that's been a problem for hundreds of years now. How do we solve this? Well, at least in California, the state has included cultural and religious sites as worthy of environmental protection. Now, you would think that, freedom of religion being in the First Amendment, that we would have actual religious freedom protections under the law. But we don't. The First Amendment protects whatever version of Christianity you might identify with, but, not really much of anything else, unfortunately. So we have to turn to environmental laws to actually protect our places of worship. And because a lot of what used to be Indian land is in governmental hands, it may not have been all that well maintained, but at least it's in public hands and not private hands. We are increasingly beginning to get access to these places again. And, part of Land Back, which is a movement, is about getting stewardship, even if it's co-management, which is the policy of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior. This is in part about religious freedom, even if that's not openly stated. Land Back is about getting back not just territory, but our rights. Our freedom to have our spiritual connections to those sacred places that we've had from time immemorial. I do want to, I don't want to run over too much, but I do want to thank the the clergy and the congregation here at St. John Newman for hosting us, and for everyone who came and attended and listened tonight. Thank you all very much.
I think we could not have done better than to decide, drink from your own wells. We've got such wonderful people at this university and in this community in the Valley. But to have Paul prompt us with that keynote and then letting people speak from their traditions and their own heart and their own experience, we can't do better than that. So on that note, I'm going to bring up my friend, my sister, Sukaina Hussein, who will speak to one issue that was raised by Reverend Rasha Bush, the Treaty of Tripoli with the Muslim world at that time, 2 centuries ago. Well, now we have a wonderful work that Sukaina and people working with CARE are doing all over this country, but right here in the Valley, we have our Deputy Executive Director to talk to us about how this issue of inclusive religious freedom needs to be addressed by the Muslim community and all of us who are not Muslims. Sukaina. Let's see if we can.
Can we do that? This is me with you.
That was the microphone, okay?
Let's see. It's gonna go all the way down.
Everything.
All right. Just roll mine up here. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So I'd also like to start off by sharing my appreciation for the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, for Jim Grant and all of the hard work that they put in every year to make sure that we get to come together and have these important conversations. I want to thank you, Reverend Paul, for your inspiring words. I really appreciated that you brought us a call to action, a call to solidarity, a call to holding people to account, and that we can't sit silent and we can't sit still, and that's what we're about in this work, so I really appreciate that as well. I hope I'll hit all the points that Jim has invited me to up here in a little bit of a different way. So I want to really respond to, I appreciated everything Reverend Paul brought up, but he mentioned a couple examples of the way that racist elected officials, that our government with a Christian nationalist agenda or white supremacist agenda responds to plurality or what they see as threats. They respond with laws, they respond with limiting immigration, they respond by putting up walls, putting kids in cages, they respond by hateful media, and we see that over and over again. Not just in the 1900s, but even recently today, we talk about limiting immigration. We can look at the Muslim ban and the way that it affects Muslims in particular. I'd like to talk a little bit about how Islam has embraced religious inclusivity, how Islam has put an emphasis on religious freedom and response to plurality, not through limits and barriers, but to welcoming. And I'm going to go through that a couple ways. I'm going to share a couple examples from the Holy Quran, our religious text. I'm going to share a couple examples from the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family. And then, of course, I'm going to be excited to talk about the work of CARE and how we are really working to protect the religious freedoms that were granted in this country. So I know many of you are familiar with the Quran and different maybe verses in our text and the spirit and beliefs behind it, but I'll share a couple specific verses that really stood out to me when we talk about religious freedom. So one of the verses I want to highlight is chapter 2, verse 256. God tells us, because the Quran is the word of God, he literally says, La ikraha fid din. That means there is no compulsion in religion. And so God is literally telling us, you cannot force someone to believe something. You cannot force someone to have a change in their heart. You cannot force faith upon someone. So when we talk about there is no compulsion in religion, you hear that from Muslims a lot. We're talking about what God told us. That might not be what you see in some Muslim governments, and it might not be what you see from some oppressive rulers, but it is what our faith teaches and what God teaches. And again, as you heard from Reverend Paul, we know that for power, for money, for rule, people manipulate religion and use it as a weapon. And so I want you all to remember that God is actually telling you there is no compulsion in religion. Another example, God tells us that there is diversity of faith on purpose. It's very intentional. Chapter 16, verse 93, God says, He could have easily made you one community of believers, but He actually didn't, right? He intentionally made us different faiths, different beliefs, and that's part of our test here as people who are working to serve God. Another quote we like to share a lot that really emphasizes this notion of inclusivity and freedom is chapter 49, verse 13. God says, "O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female, and made you into peoples and tribes so you may get to know one another. Surely the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous among you, and Allah is all-knowing and all-aware." And we talk about this verse a lot when it comes to ethnic diversity, racial diversity, different languages and things like that, but I think faith is a part of your identity too. So knowing each other, knowing each other's faith is a part of building that community. Even in the Quran, when we see God talk about different groups of people, He doesn't just say, oh, those non-Muslims or those people. He calls them by the words they choose for themselves. So He says the Christians, He says the Jews or the Sabians or the communities that the Prophet interacted with. He uses the word for people that they chose for themselves, which to me is a sign of respect and a sign of inclusivity as well. And one of the beliefs as a part of our faith, I'm a Muslim because I believe it is the one true path. I believe as a Muslim that Islam is my path to serving God and achieving success in this life. But as a Muslim, I cannot say that automatically saying La ilaha illallah, that there is no God but Allah, is an automatic ticket to heaven. That's definitely not the case. And I would never say that all non-Muslims will never reach heaven or go to hell, because that's not the case in our faith too. When you're believing in Allah, you're actually acting out the actions of what it means to submit to Him, what it means to live by the Quran, what it means to live according to the teachings of the Prophet. And so being a Muslim does not guarantee you heaven, and being a non-Muslim does not mean you're going to hell. And to me, that's religious inclusivity, that there isn't just one kind of stamp that's going to be successful. We all have to work for it. And as God says, it's those who are most righteous among us that's going to achieve that pleasure of Allah. A couple more examples, and I'll try to keep to time because I'm getting late, are from the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family. There's really a great story, and you may have heard it a couple different times, but there was a time when the Prophet was with his companions. They were gathered somewhere, and they see a procession go by of a person for a funeral procession of a Jewish person that went by, and the Prophet stopped what he was doing to stand up and acknowledge and pay respects to the deceased person who was going by. And one of his companions turned to him and said, "What are you doing? Don't you know that's a Jewish person? Like, why are you getting up to pay respect to him?" And the Prophet turned back to him and he specifically said, "But isn't he a human?" And so that brings me to the saying of Imam Ali, who was the cousin of the Prophet and the successor of the Prophet in the Shia Muslim faith, where he tells us that all men, or women, are of two. They're either your brother in faith or they're your equal in humanity. And so whether or not they identify as a Muslim or a person of Abrahamic faith or not, they still deserve that respect, the dignity, and that inclusivity and freedom. Another example, and I'll share this really quick, is when the charter of Medina, which was the city where the Prophet is currently buried, and the city where he spent the later years of his life, was developed, there were actual written rights for all those who lived there, regardless of their faiths. whether they identified as Muslim or not. So this constitution that was created by the Prophet, the first constitution for Medina, which was known as Yathrib at the time, included rights, included written statements that said that people of other religious backgrounds have these rights or those rights. And so again, a very clear demonstration of inclusivity, plurality, and freedom for other folks. And I'll maybe use another minute or two, if that's okay, Jim, to talk about what religious freedom and protecting those rights look like for us today. So as Jim mentioned, I have been with CARE, which is a nonprofit organization, for several years, and we have a couple of our staff folks here tonight. CARE is the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR. We are the largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization in the country. In addition to doing work like providing immigration services, doing youth leadership programming, civic engagement for the Muslim community, a core part of our work is protecting civil liberties. So in 2022, we had 150 cases, over 150 cases that were reported to us for a violation of folks' rights and liberties throughout the Sacramento and Central Valley region. This can be anything from a woman whose hijab, her head covering, was pulled off for a mugshot when she was arrested for a traffic stop. It includes folks who are not given ability or opportunity to pray or break their fast during the month of Ramadan. It includes violations of rights of people who are incarcerated and not giving them food that they're allowed to eat according to Islamic teachings, or making accommodations for them when they're fasting, things like that. So we see these cases all the time, all year round, and our work is literally to protect the religious liberties and rights that folks have. Not only are we doing that on a case-by-case basis through lawyers that are working against the sheriff's office or workplaces or schools and really holding people to account to these liberties and rights that are granted to them, but we're also working against systems. So Reverend Paul mentioned there's bad actors that are holding us back. I'd say it's bad actors and systems and infrastructure and institutions and millions of dollars of funding that is going into upholding white supremacy and keeping people down. And so we're actually working to pass policies that will undo things like the Muslim ban. We have a couple of bills, and I won't go into all of them this year, that CARE is actually leading: SB 309, SB 461, AB 1503, that our one SB 309 is actually going to provide accommodation for people in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, ability to have facial hair and head covering according to their religious practices, because that was taken away from them earlier this year, and a couple of other bills that are going to allow folks to take a day off of work for their religious needs, for school holidays for children. One day we're asking for to apply towards their religious beliefs and needs. And so it's things like this that hopefully will address the systems that are under play, in addition to the one-on-one acts of violations of religious freedom. Thank you.
Our fourth respondent is my friend, Dr. Andrew Fiala. I'm going to read what Andy wrote, as if you'll get a clear idea of just who this person is, and then I'll tell you something else about him. Andrew Fiala, PhD, is professor of philosophy and the director of the Ethics Center at California State University, Fresno, the author or editor of more than a dozen books, has published nearly 100 articles and book chapters. One relevant recent title is Seeking Common Ground, a Theist-Atheist Dialogue, with co-author Peter Admirand, 2021, featuring a foreword by Rabbi Jack Moline, the former president of the InterFaith Alliance, which Paul is the, you might say, incumbent or present current one. Andy Fiala writes a regular column on ethics, you can read it in the Bee, on religion and politics, but also a column on secularism for Only Sky. Here is the book you're going to want to get. It puts in a personal relationship with a Catholic in Dublin how Dr. Fiala creates a dialogue over virtues which unite and need not separate people of every different form of faith or non-faith. Most recently, though, he almost outdid himself, writing interfaith work needs to include the non-religious. It's not enough that we have tremendous dialogue among believers like some of us, but there is a giant lot of people, 20% maybe at least, who do not affiliate, but they have tremendous contributions to make to dialogue over the issues that Paul raised tonight. Andy, your turn. Dr. Andy Fidella.
Thank you, Jim. I witnessed what Jim did to make this event happen, so can we thank him again? You wouldn't believe what he did to pull this off. So I've been asked to speak from the non-religious perspective. And I have to admit, it's a weird thing to be, a non-faith person in an interfaith world. But I want you to know, and you may be aware of this, that the fastest growing religion in the United States is no religion. Something like the most recent data, like 30% of Americans do not affiliate with any religious tradition. That includes about 10% who are either atheists or agnostics. But of that 30, subtract those 10, that's 20% of folks who have willfully, consciously disaffiliated from religious traditions. Paul, one of the things you talked about was the demographic shift. And so kind of a question for you maybe you can respond to. I suspect that Christian nationalism is afraid of secularism. And I think you see this especially in the discourse. When you read what the Christian nationalists are saying, they blame secularism. And Ken, you mentioned secularism also. I think we need to do a better job of understanding what secularism is in this country, and I think that's related to the need for civic literacy. Many of our fellow citizens don't have a clue about the First Amendment. There's survey data on this. I've given lots of talks on this. People, the survey says, well, what's in the First Amendment? People say, well, is that the one about the right to bear arms? And you'd think a lot of people would know that one, because we talk a lot about the Second Amendment. We just don't understand our own system of government. It's essential, however, for what it is to be Americans, that we are free to practice our own faith or non-faith in our own way, and the government is not to intrude on that practice through the establishment of religion. We need better, I think, civic literacy as part of this project. I'm going to say a couple words about virtues because I'm an ethics professor, so thank you for plugging my book. Let me say, this was not an easy book to write. So a person who I did not know reached out to me out of the blue, a Catholic theologian, and he just wanted to talk to an atheist. Most atheists did not respond to his email. I was the only one. And it felt a little strange, I would say. So we had 2 years of conversations, and what we discovered is, Sukena, we're all human. That your lovely, phrase about respecting our common humanity. We love our children. We love music and art. We love our countries. There's so much we share in common, and it's very easy to be divided, especially the way the political rhetoric unfolds in our nation, this polarized world we live in. It's unfortunate. One of the things that we discovered in the book, or we talked about, is a set of common virtues that bring people together. So there were H's and C's we came up with. You got to come up with something memorable. But the H's included, let me make sure I get this right, hospitality, humility, and honesty. Let me say a word about each. Hospitality, that is the spirit of welcoming someone and caring enough about them as a human being to ask what they need and how we can support them. We talk about toleration in the First Amendment, gives us the space of toleration, but toleration is insufficient for human beings, right? It's cold toleration. Hospitality is warm. Humility, the other H virtues, humility is being willing to admit that you don't know everything. Being willing to say that you're wrong about things. Being willing to shut up and listen rather than speaking and yelling. And we're not good at that in our world. Honesty, being able and willing to say what you really believe, despite the pushback. And actually, part of the issue for the non-religious is, I think a lot of non-religious folks are kind of embarrassed of it. Because there's so much religiosity in our world, there's no space for us to say what we believe. And so, Jim, you referenced this thing I said, long story, but anyway, I said, atheists need to show up to these things. And we don't often. We're not honest in public. So then there were 3 C's. Let me share with you the C's: courage, curiosity, and compassion. So courage is related to that willingness to be honest and being willing to put yourself in weird and strange situations, which I know folks in the interfaith community are good at. You know, when you go and visit a place of worship, it's kind of intimidating. We need to have the courage to feel out of place and uncomfortable, I think. Curiosity, connected to hospitality in a sense, but trying to find out what other people believe. And often we don't ask, we just assume, you know? That's imposing rather than receiving. So curiosity. And then, of course, compassion, obviously important in this world related to the work you're doing. You know, we're so quick to judge and leave people alone in their suffering, when in fact, we're all in it together and we all need help. So the spirit of compassion there, very important. If I can end with a couple questions for you, prompted by your talk. So, one of the things I'm very concerned about is the violence component. You mentioned the Christian nationalists also say, and yes, violence might be needed. I think with Dr. Kapoor sitting right next to you, we need more and better teaching about nonviolence. And I'm wondering, where's that happening? I'm actually worried that our world does not teach anything about nonviolence. Our films, our celebration of war, our entire culture is oriented towards militarism and war. Where are we learning those lessons of nonviolence? I'd like to hear more. Another problem, question, worry. We don't know the right words to talk about this challenge of Christian nationalism. I heard you say, I know it's just, you know, the word came out. You said, how are we going to defeat Christian nationalism? Is that the right word? I'm curious. Can we convert Christian? I mean, is the right word there convert? Is the word separate? You know, people are talking about the national divorce. You heard this? I mean, what is the frame for moving forward? I like the hopeful vision. I think we are making progress. But what do we do? And is defeating really what we need to do? And then if it's not defeating, what would it be? And if it's converting, how in the heck is that going to work? How do we get people to join our team? At any rate, thank you very much for your comments. What a beautiful talk. I mean, I wish I could give a talk like that. The narrative began and ended. It was wonderful. And thanks again to my colleagues, and thank you, Jim Grant, for organizing.
There's no words to thank everyone who has contributed to this initial evening. It's only the kickoff. For those that signed up, you know there will be a Temple Beth Israel tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Breakfast, wonderful, kosher, and also halal, and also vegetarian. So everybody should be pleased, unless you're a carnivore. We're trying to get less of us. We should have less of us. We're going to have a whole day, 8 to 2:30, if you can do it. If you haven't registered, we need you to please sign up right now after we leave. If you came in tonight, I hope you registered, or if you didn't, we're going to have people at the checkout booth over there to let us know that you were here tonight. If you registered, we'll just highlight your name. And if you're new to us, we'd love to get your name and your email address so we can keep in touch with you. The other thing to say is there are certain people who made this event possible, and they are major contributors. So let me just name off those that need to hear: the churches, the universities, the organizations that funded this wonderful event that we only began tonight. There would be the Community United Church of Christ, an original former of this wonderful group 25 years ago. First Congregational Church of Fresno, the Big Red, Fresno City College, Fresno Pacific University, the Fresno State Department of Ethics and Conflict Studies, Philosophy, and the Gandhi Center. All of those departments work together to make this event with a generous donation. The Human Rights Coalition of Central California, the InterFaith Alliance of Central California, the Islamic Cultural Center of Fresno, which unfortunately is no longer. We need to work to bring back the energy of the Islamic community here in Fresno. The Sophia's House, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Fresno, the St. Paul Catholic Newman Center, the Willow Avenue Mennonite Church, Temple Beth Israel, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno, and Wesley United Methodist Church. When you hear those names, you get an idea of the breadth of interfaith here in the Valley. Other communities will be represented tomorrow, but they might not have sent in a major donation like these big boys did. Big ladies. The ones who had maybe more to give gave a lot. Others will be there tomorrow sharing from their traditions as believers in Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and even some Christians will be there also. Don't want to forget some of us. Anyways, if you came in, you should have gotten a little card. If you use your little phone and do the QR code, you could write a question that would get sent to us to know that you'd like that addressed tomorrow, because there's no time right now. The other thing, this beautiful picture of Dr. Kapoor with his link of love, if you go to the QR code here and zoom in, you will be introduced to those wonderful departments at Fresno State that I named and bumbled through because they were written so small, I had my eyes. Anyways, it would be the Ethics Center, it would be Conflict and Peace Studies, it would be the Gandhi Center, and the Philosophy Department. It's all going to come up on your phone. It's an introduction to the wonderful work of our Fresno State, and Fresno Pacific, and Fresno City. And also, this year, we have friends coming from Clovis community also. We're like so blessed. I'm going to let the Reverend have a chance, as he'd like. He'll be the last one to speak, to kind of wrap us up tonight, respond in any way he would like to the ones who presented things to him. And on that note, I invite you to sign in when you leave if you haven't signed in. Join us tomorrow at 8 at Temple Beth Israel if you can. That's the one that's on Maroa, just south of Herndon. And Paul, your turn to send us away tonight with a blessing. Thank you.
Well, I feel we have been very blessed already, and I am not going to take up much more of your time. I do want to thank each of you very much for those thoughtful contributions. I feel like the opportunity is to learn from one another. And, you know, just especially you, my friend, who's is a Ken. I'm sorry, I don't have my name right, Ken. You know, I think just helping us like get literally the landscape, the sacred landscape where we are, is such it just opens the mind, and it helps us realize, oh, okay, there's all sorts of ways to to go at this issue, and how can the more I learn help me incorporate the broader views into my work? And literally, as you were speaking, I was like, we need to do more. InterFaith Alliance National needs to do more. And I was like, how do we do more? And I was like, okay, we're going to come up with it. And I was like, no, just listen. We'll figure that out. But like, the opportunity here is to learn, to do more for one another. And hearing stories like that is just so important. So I want to thank you for that, all your stories and your information. Every time, I know you don't feel like you were preaching at me, but you were preaching to me. Because every time I hear all those stories from the Prophet Muhammad, from the tradition, I'm like, yeah, oh my God, thank God for those stories. They give me language. They give me strength. As a Christian, those stories, I say, wow. And it's such like, you're like basically creating a corridor, creating a broad, a beautiful entrance, and say, hey, come, learn. And isn't that a wonderful part of our work together, that we can learn from one another, that we can grow? And this is the wonderful part of interfaith work, is that we have systems that we need to be working on, and we have other things, but we can all expand our own spirits and our own knowledge and our own moral understanding, and expand, the strength of our moral code by learning from one another. I appreciate that. I do want to say, I couldn't agree more about systems. One of the things that I think was interesting about that story, I was quoting Rabbi Lawson when I was saying that. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about her that I think we can forget, especially in moments like this when it feels so raw and so under threat, is if we can figure out where can we identify progress and understand what it meant to get there, and understand who sacrificed to get us there, and how much we have to learn from them. And so I didn't have time to, you can hear the whole interview on State of Belief. But she was saying, like, my grandparents underwent such deprivation with Jim Crow. And here I am, a queer woman who can marry her partner. And so she is acknowledging that something has changed for her family. And she's not saying it's all there, because every day she experiences that it's not there. But I do want us to recognize no progress is irreparable. History shows us that. But also that progress is possible. And I think both of those things can be held hand in hand. You asked amazing questions, Andrew, and I have been very interested in the nonviolence. That is a broader civic question. The language of defeat, I get pushback about that a lot. If I didn't feel we were at an existential moment where we just can't let Christian nationalism become the dominant political force in our country, because it will mean so much harm for so many people. So I don't know what else to call it. So I get it, military, it's terrible, but I don't know what else to call it, because the stakes feel very high to me. And I have all kinds of privileges, so they're much higher for more. But they're very high, I got a family, I have the same gender partner, I have 2 boys, I feel existential threat. So I don't know what else to call it, aside from winning. But I do like the idea we have to keep on thinking, because part of it is, how do we invite people into this other vision of America that does not need to demean them, that can be celebrating exactly who they are, but not letting that have to be me. And so I think figuring out that. The other thing that we're going to have dinner time sometime talk, because part of my work was at Princeton as the associate dean of the chapel in religious life, and a great deal of the people who I worked with were people who were not religious. I had a lot of young people, and what I always challenged them is to say, okay, so what are you? And so how do it's very easy for me, Jesus said, but they don't have that, they don't have that. If I say I'm a Christian, so I say this and this. So I was like, the submerged architecture of your worldview and your moral code, bring it above ground and share it. But how do you talk about it? Who are the philosophers? Who are the artists? Who are the poets? Who are the, who is inspiring you and creating a cohesive worldview? And bring it into these rooms and say, the secular voice, there's not going to be a secular voice, but there will be an opportunity for a secular perspective in any room. But also bring something to share. And the more that we can help young people or old people, anybody who identifies as secular, to be able to say, these are the things I hold sacred. They won't use that word. These are the things that I feel are core values for me. And I want to share those with you. And in the same way that I am learning from my Muslim sister, I'm going to learn from my secular. My greatest teacher, one of my greatest teachers is was a philosopher, was my cousin, named Dick Roy, who was like a very kind of scary secular humanist for some people. But he was really like known as this, like they would identify him particularly. He was a philosopher and then became more of a humanities professor and more interested in poetry. But he was able to articulate a vision for living a life with society and a vision for being together. And it was informed not by a religious faith, but by a broad secular worldview. And he inspired me so much. He wrote a great book called Achieving Our Country, using the language of James Baldwin, who initiated that phase. So my encouragement is come into these spaces. And we have to be more intentional about inviting people into those spaces. So that we can't assume, oh, well, we've invited everybody we could. We always need to be seeing who's not here. And who's not at the, who's not. So that includes all sorts of other people that we might be looking at who might not be able to be in this room today, but who we would love to be part of our broader collective life together. So my hope is that these remarks are responding to the generous remarks of my colleagues and also just my deep gratitude for all of you coming out in this crazy weather and to listen to someone you've never heard of. But I just really appreciate you being here and us being part of a community together. And this is an amazing room. This is a beautiful room. This is all we really need, honestly. I mean, we need more people to join us, but this is an amazing room. So just let's relish that we're together. Let's relish that we're like seeing one another and we're part of it. And we're imagining together a future, imagining together a community that really will value everyone in this room and the people who are on the margins who didn't even know to come here tonight. So I just encourage you to relish this moment. Go enjoy some fish, and I look forward to seeing you all, and anybody who can come tomorrow. It's going to be very interesting. I'm just going to presage it for just a second, but I'm going to be talking about the internet. One of my passions is the internet, and where it fits in technology and religion, and hate on the internet, but also the power of the internet to connect. And so that's one thing, and also interfaith advocacy, and how we can come together to actually meet the needs of our communities. Much of you in this room know so much about that, but it will be an opportunity for us to have a kind of a collective experience of it. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And again, thank you, Jim, for all of this.